Good evening, folks. Looks like it's time for us to get started. I'd like to welcome you all out to this presentation tonight. And I guess I don't really need to say a whole lot about it because you'll see what it's about when it gets started. But I'd like to introduce Utahna Jessop, who will be presenting this tonight. She is my wife. I'm very honored to be helping her with this and whatever I can do. So, without any further ado, Utahna.
Well, good evening, friends and fellow researchers. Is the sound okay? Can you all hear me fine? How about in the back? Raise your hand if you can hear me good. Okay, very good. It really is great to see you all out today. As you can tell, I'm a little nervous. I'm more at home sitting down there than I am up here. But just a little about myself. I'm a trustee with the Ancient Historical Research Foundation and an avid researcher of all things ancient. I just love it. I've lived in Utah most of my life and have fallen in love with the mysteries of history that seem to be in every corner of our state. The more I learn, the more I understand how much history has been lost and even deliberately hidden from us. Sometimes discovering the truth can be as difficult as it is exciting. But this afternoon, we're going to take a look at Brewers Cave, which is a controversial subject. But as many of you know, Brewers Cave is purported to be a burial chamber containing giant mummies, artifacts, and ancient metal records. The location of the cave is unknown, leaving many of the details shrouded in mystery. There's a lot of misinformation out there. Stories have circulated, and separating fact from fiction is difficult at best, but that is exactly what we're trying to do. I'm not here to tell you that the story is true. I will share with you the facts that I have learned and some interesting correlations, but then it's up to you to decide for yourself. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Our story begins with George Keller. He's the adopted son of Jacob and Anna Keller. George grew up in Manti and spent a lot of time in the hills with Lone Eagle, his boyhood Indian friend. Lone Eagle showed George what he called the Cave of the Great Spirit. Lone Eagle's father had shown it to him when he was about 6 years old and explained to him that it was a sacred burial place protected by the spirit of a great Indian chief. The boys often played there. Now, as time went by, Lone Eagle moved away. George worked for many years on the Keller farm, often thinking of the cave that he'd visited in his youth. Later in life, Keller fell from his horse during a terrible snowstorm and lost all his fingers to frostbite. By the 1950s, he was an older gentleman doing childlike chores to provide for himself. He was honest and respected by many in the community when he crossed paths with John Brewer. Now, this is John Brewer and his wife Doris, the year that he found the cave. In 1955, Earl John Brewer was 22 years old, living in Moroni, Utah, and working at odd jobs to support his young wife and family. Intrigued by relics of the past, he often gathered arrowheads from the hills and valleys of San Pete. Hoping to display his collection in the county fair, he was making a beautiful Indian bust out of arrowheads when he realized that he didn't have enough arrowheads to finish the project, but he heard that George Keller knew of a place. So for a bottle of wine, Keller told John Brewer about a cave behind the temple. Brewer could not find it the first time that he looked, and he offered Keller another bottle of wine if he would take him there himself. They drove up the hill behind the temple. Keller parked his truck and pointed out an opening. Brewer found 30 arrowheads right off and returned to the truck a very happy man, commenting, "No wonder I couldn't find it. It wasn't on the temple hill at all, but the one in back of it." Well, thus began the adventure of a lifetime. Fortunately for us, John Brewer kept a journal. He wrote of his discoveries and often described the items that he found. He also spoke of going to the cave not only to dig, but to work, to study, and to think. It became his refuge, so to speak. The published portion of the journal is believed by some to have been fabricated, especially since Brewer himself said that no one had seen his journal. However, quoting Terry Carter, founder of the Ancient Historical Research Foundation, just like John Brewer's cave, his journal has also spawned great debate as to its authenticity. While researching and interviewing people over the years, I have come to the confident conclusion that this is indeed John Brewer's own excerpts from his personal journal. Now, many of you know Terry Carter, and that he has done a tremendous amount of unbiased research on this subject. He's very generously shared much of what I'm presenting today, and I would like to say many thanks to you, Terry. He's back here. Now, as we follow the journal excerpts, we get an inside look at John Brewer's thoughts and feelings about events that were unfolding, and a feel for what kind of man he was. Just 1 week after Keller showed him the cave, he writes in his journal, "Went to the cave and moved a little dirt." Brewer immediately began finding artifacts of great interest. In addition to arrowheads, an Indian drill, and pottery, he found a little book. This book had marks on the front page, a scorpion motif, which looked like it was stamped rather than cut or engraved. The book was covered with a mud-like pottery that was very hard to remove, and it had a copper band around it to hold it together. He also found a little gold plate. He worried about finding this one because gold is a highly prized metal and can cause trouble. He found an inscribed bell-like object made of lead. At this point, he had dug down 4 or 5 feet. He eventually found at least 2 of these bells. This picture is actually 2 different photos of the same bell, but there were more. He found several more items of lead, as seen here. He also found objects of wood or bark, something resembling a metal chisel, but too soft to use as one, and a large inscribed stone, measuring 8 by 8 by 28 inches. Now, one very interesting item was a chunk of pine gum, which he tossed aside, thinking that he might just chew on it sometime. It was several months later when he decided to take it home and cut it open and see if there were bugs inside, similar to what you'd see in amber. Well, he didn't find any bugs, but he did find a rock with a map drawn on it, which had been preserved in the pine gum. He spent a lot of time trying to figure out that map. He bought a Utah map and cut it up into pieces about the size that he thought would match this map rock. Well, that didn't work. The size was all wrong. He tried to piece it back together, but in the end had to buy a new map. 4 months later, he thought he had it figured out. Thinking it was in northern Utah, he knew his old car wouldn't make it that far. So he had to wait until he could buy a new car, drive to the area, and then nothing matched up at all. Time to start all over again. It was another 4 years before he finally realized that it matched the Sanpete area. The map rock was described by Brewer's acquaintances as having a central location with little footprints that went out to other sites. It was marking burials and repositories. Now, reports vary as to how many locations were on the map, but supposedly 7 of them were in Sanpete. We know he found at least 2 other locations, one near Spring City and one across the valley near Wales, where he found inscribed stones. You can see the one up here on the right was broken when he struck it with a pick. And incidentally, his reading of the map rock was accurate within 15 feet of the target. Using compass skills that he learned in the Army, he located the first site. He dug a small circle where his lines crossed, and then circled out from there. And by the time he had dug out from the original spot about 15 feet, he found the landmark and knew he had it right. Now, another site that was marked on the map was an ancient library, a large repository of records. The site should have been on the west side of the valley on a bald spot often called West Point. According to the map, it would be marked with a certain symbol. John Brewer spent a lot of time searching for that symbol, but was never able to find it. He decided that it was just not meant for him to find. Now, there are very interesting antiquities all across San Pete. We're going to take a look at several of them just to give you an idea of the diverse history of the area before we get back to the cave. Now, here are a few sites over on the west side of the valley. There are ancient structures, possibly possibly tombs, mounds, rock walls, stone floors, and more. A cement sample taken from under this stone floor was analyzed, and the report was very promising. Under the microscope, the sample appeared to be a prehistoric formation, a mortar that was mixed anciently, similar to the ancient Egyptian mortars. This Hebrew mound near Spring City was shown to me by my friends Dan and Jean Nielsen. The Strait family owns this man-made hill with sloped sides and a flat top. It was identified by Professor Lambert Dolphin as a Hebrew Watchtower mound and is similar to those scattered across the Holy Land. It is rumored that Dr. Paul Chessman found 3 metal plates buried in this hill, and that scans have shown that an ancient rock wall lies just beneath the surface of the mound. I have not yet been able to verify that. According to an acquaintance of Brewer, the location of these panels was marked on the map. These are above the Manti Quarry on the northeast side of the Temple Hill. Up here on the left, upper left, is the ledges where the glyphs are, and then 2 photos of the actual glyphs. The glyphs seem to be a mixture of Ojibwa, Egyptian, Aztec, Mayan, Hebrew, and other cultural symbols. Some claim these glyphs are modern creations. Professor James Harris and others felt they were very old, possibly even more than 2,000 years. Now, on the lower left here is what some believe an ancient carved head of a serpent, similar to those found in Central America. Another interesting record on stone was the Mahantai panel, located in the same area. This may very well be all that's left of the panel. The Mahantai panel was translated in 1856 as, I, Mahantai, the second king of the Lamanites, in 5 valleys in the mountains, make this record in the 1200th year since we came out of Jerusalem. And I have 3 sons gone to the south country to live by hunting antelope and deer. Professor James Harris verifies this interpretation as a mixture of Egyptian and Utah Fremont. Along with that, Brigham Young told Warren Snow as they stood at a corner of the Manti Temple lot, here is the spot where the prophet Moroni stood and dedicated this piece of land for a temple site, and that is the reason why the location is made here. We can't move it from this spot. And here we have some interesting anomalies. The old stone quarry up Manti Canyon had all the signs of having been used anciently for extensive building projects. While working at the quarry, William Potter turned over a large stone that had been half buried in the earth to discover that the underside had been sculpted with several figures of heads resembling those found on ancient Greek temples. Orson Pratt believed that one of the figures was a representation of Zeus, and that the 2 main sculptures were in every way identical to those found on the cornices and columns of ancient Greek temples, such as the great temple of Athena at the Acropolis. Sophus E. Jensen saw ancient inscriptions at the stone quarry in Manti Canyon that were identical to the inscriptions on Temple Hill. An early settler and temple worker, Pete Nielsen, claimed that a foundation stone had been excavated from a cavern beneath the temple and contained inscriptions which looked to him to be Greek letters. He said that it could still be seen by accessing the temple basement. Adelia Cox Sidwell reminisces, as kids, can somebody get the door? As kids, we used to play on the south side of Temple Hill, up near the top where the big rock protruded with the strange old writing on it. Isaac Morley climbed the south slope to examine the large stones worked by human hands, thought to be the remains of the foundation of an ancient temple that once stood on top of that sacred mound. He made copies of the several stone inscriptions, compared them to the books, and found 17 likenesses, 14 unidentified, and 7 others unintelligible. Now, I hiked all along the crest of the hill from the south slope, but there doesn't seem to be any inscriptions left. Early history of Manti tells us, Chief Walkera of the Sanpete Utes recounted that the Old Ones had built a stone altar with strange carvings on its base at the crest of the sacred hill where the Manti temple now resides. It was disassembled by the Spaniards in search of gold and riches. Early settlers could still see the remains. When Brother Gifford accidentally split open one of the stones, he found it to be hollow and said it appeared to be an ancient repository of records. It seems that many cultures have contributed to the historical remains of the Sanpete Valley. Earl John Brewer spent many long hours in his cave, digging, studying, and pondering. Hoping to identify the age of the items that he was uncovering, he got a book on archaeology and carefully filled bottles of soil samples, took notes about what he was collecting. He could tell that the Indians had been in the cave, but as he dug down, he uncovered the remains of other cultures that he believed had used the cave over a span of several thousand years. He sincerely wanted to understand the meaning of what he found. He was very prayerful and humbly studied what Joseph Smith taught about how to receive answers to prayers. He sent a letter to church authorities for help and waited a long time for an answer. Meanwhile, he attended church and read the Book of Mormon several times, hoping to find the answers there. Through all of his study, he came to the conclusion that the oldest people who used the cave must have been the Jaredites. Now, who are the Jaredites? Who were the Jaredites? We learned from the Book of Ether and the Book of Mormon that the Jaredites were the descendants of Jared and his brother, who lived from approximately 2500 BC to 600 BC. They were originally from Mesopotamia when the Lord confounded the languages at the Tower of Babel. They fled across the ocean on unique barges and established an ancient civilization in the Americas. They were a large and mighty people, accustomed to traveling vast distances, and were fierce in battle. They prospered nearly 2,000 years before the nation was destroyed in a civil war. Hugh Nibley suggests that Jaredites are essentially similar to the Mongols in culture. It's interesting to note that Brigham Young, while on a visit to the saints in central Utah, said some of the Gadianton robbers were in the vicinity of Sanpete looking for treasures of those Jaredites who came from the tower. Now, June 17, 1957, 2 years after he first visited the cave, John writes in his journal, "I seem to feel sometimes that I'm being watched, but when I check and see, I see no one. But the feeling will not leave. Even when I'm in the cave, I get it real strong, but when I go outside, it leaves me." Quoting from J. Golden Barton, it goes on. Sometime later, he went up to the cave to think, and he felt the presence of another person in the room who held a light. His first impression was that he had been followed. He was then seized upon a force of power that threw his body to the ground and left him looking at his body from above. While in this state, the person introduced himself as Ether, an ancient spirit, and explained that Brewer was not to seek financial gain from the things in the chamber, but to protect the discovery. He was told that the LDS Church authorities should be informed and made aware of the discovery, but were not to be involved at this time. Brewer said that he was unworthy to be a custodian because he smoked and drank a little and was not active in the church, but Ether told him he had other attributes and was to be very careful in protecting the contents of the cave. So, work at the cave progressed. While digging out the upper chamber where the arrowheads and other artifacts were, Brewer came upon an opening with stairs leading down into a tomb. Now, this is where the story gets really interesting. There were numerous records, artifacts, and tools inside. He found stone forms for shaping plates and a hammer and 50 little chisel-type tools used to inscribe the records. It was clear that this had been used extensively as a workroom and even had a furnace at one end. John Brewer made a sketch of the cave here on the right with two different views The upper one is like a bird's eye view, you can see down, and then the bottom one is more of a horizontal, so you can see into the cave. There's some unexplored area on that top one on the left, kind of a T-shape. We'll mention that again. As far as we know, he never dug that part out. On the left here, his granddaughter, Trisyla Brewer, did some artwork, and that really gives you a feel for the tomb, I think. So, taking a closer look at this cave, each item on the next slide is going to be numbered in red. Number 1 is the unexplored area. Number 2 is the bench containing artifacts. Number 3 is a wall of stone boxes. Now, he didn't notice this at first. It looked like a normal dirt wall. But at some point, water had been in the tomb and had washed some of the mud away, exposing some bark. When he took a closer look at this strange bark, he realized that the wall was made of stone boxes wrapped in juniper bark and pine pitch, and then smeared with mud. Number 4 is a new 30-foot entry into the tomb, which may have been the old furnace chimney. Worried that someone else would find the tomb, he made a new access, which he concealed with a large flat rock and brush, and then closed the entrance with dynamite. Number 5, the stairs leading from the upper chamber down to the tomb. Number 6, bottomless pit and natural death trap. This was probably covered with sticks and dirt of some sort at one time so that it would not be visible. Number 7, safe passage around that last step. For those who didn't know about the tomb, this would be a safe way in and out, bypassing the death trap. But if you didn't know and you went straight down in, you would surely fall to your death. Number 8, that was a shelf containing dust, painted pottery, and a detailed copper bracelet in the design of a rattlesnake. It kind of coiled around the arm. He mentioned that it looked like something a woman would wear, and that possibly the eyes had jewels in them at one point. Number 9 is a wooden bench made and used by John Brewer while working on the maps. Remember, I mentioned the work that he spent on the map. Sitting on top of this bench is a small box where he put his diary and records. Number 10 is a box with a metal cover containing John Brewer's prized artifacts. He put them here after recording where they were found. Number 11 is a box containing the Spanish armor he found on the west side of the valley. Number 12, he made another amazing discovery. 2 stone sarcophagi containing very large mummified bodies stacked one above the other. Unable to take photos of the bodies, he drew sketches. I've been told it was actually his son, John, who was the artist, but I can't confirm that. I want you to see these mummies. We're going to talk about them in a few minutes, but you had to at least have a sneak peek. Okay, these are photos of the general area where Brewers Cave should be found. Lone Eagle, George Keller, and John Brewer were not the only ones to roam these hills and explore caverns. Maud Cox, an elderly woman whose family had owned high ground to the north of the temple and near the Keller farm. As a little girl, she had heard her family speak of the discovery of a cave or tomb that required a ladder to gain entrance. There was a long, narrow passage that led to a chamber where artifacts and a burial site were located. She did not know the location of the chamber, but George Keller had told her of a certain mark located near the cave of the Great Spirit. Could Brewer's Cave be the same place that her family had discovered? Lucian Bound tells a similar story. As young boys, Lucian and his friends dared each other to go into a small cave they had discovered in the hills. There was a drop-off inside, and they tossed rocks in to see how deep it would go. Well, as kids, they couldn't hear the rocks land, so they figured it went all the way to China. One of the boys, with long arms, reached into the hole and came out with a part of a step from an old stick ladder that had been tied together with a chunk of leather. Years later, one of the boys decided to dig a mine shaft-type tunnel 25 feet below the opening to see if he could find the bottom. He did. He realized that they had not heard the rocks falling in the hole because the bottom was covered in several inches of what he called flour dust. He found a large rock wall and tunneled around it, only to realize it was actually a stone coffin. He said that he used a tire iron to pry the lid up and saw the remains of a mummy. Again, we wonder, could they have happened upon what later became known as Brewers Cave? Finally, the long-awaited meeting with church representatives. March 1st, 1974, Dr. Paul Chessman of the Department of Religion at BYU, his wife Millie, Mark E. Peterson of the Quorum of the 12, J. Golden Barton and Wayne Hamby met with John Brewer and his son at the home of Bishop Merlin Nielsen to discuss the Brewers Cave. Brewer had waited many years and was eager to tell them the story of the cave, the stone boxes, the records, and the giant mummified remains. The group listened intently. They were excited and very impressed, especially when he reached into his briefcase and brought out about 60 plates of various sizes, shapes, and metallurgical composition. All of the plates presented were inscribed with characters in an unknown writing. Brewer showed them these 7 gold plates, which he had placed in a picture frame under glass for their protection. And here are a couple of lead plates, one in the shape of a man's head. A cast and replica was made of this one. You'll notice the actual size fits right into his hand. And then there's an interesting spiraled inscription on the one on the right. Lucian Bound handled these plates when he was asked to photograph them, and he commented that the lead plates were so soft they would mold right to your hand. Now, I'm not sure the composition of all of these different ones, but Lucian also mentioned that some of the brass plates were so sharp that they would cut your fingers, and so brittle that if you dropped them, he thought they would shatter like glass. Now, those men at the meeting were all united in the opinion that Brewer was most likely telling the truth. A little reluctantly, Brewer agreed to take Dr. Paul Chessman to the tomb as soon as the snow melted. Then, an archaeological team from BYU would follow up with the necessary evaluation, but sadly, this never happened. Chessman was a large man, and Brewer would have to widen the narrow access tunnel to get him in. He was working on that, even putting carpet in the bottom because he didn't feel that Chessman should have to scoot along in the dirt. But then the tunnel ceiling caved in. Many personal problems further delayed the plan. Controversy began to swirl. He had shown some of the artifacts to priesthood quorums, school children, friends, and neighbors. The stories and artifacts were attracting ill-intentioned people. Items were being stolen from him. He soon began to fear for his life and the lives of his family. He became the subject of critical newspaper articles. Dr. Jesse Jennings and Dr. Ray Matheny were very critical of him and suggested he was a fraud. Understandably, Brewer was embarrassed and felt betrayed. BYU, University of Utah, and Dr. Paul Chessman had all obtained artifacts from Brewer. The artifacts pictured on the left here are described in the middle a little bit, with the results on the right. Now, I'm not going to read this. I'm just going to paraphrase a bit. It was determined that all of the inscriptions were sharp and clear, therefore interpreted to be modern. The one on top had metal residue in the grooves of the inscription, suggesting that a soft nail or pocket knife had been used to make the inscription. The second one down had no trace of metal, suggesting to them a dental pick or other hard object was used. Also, the cotton fibers and pitch that it had been wrapped in did not seem very old. Not very favorable results. Dr. Jennings of U of U called it a ridiculous hoax. But in all fairness, he had his mind made up that the entire story was concocted before he ever saw the artifacts. Dr. Matheny of BYU felt that the inscriptions were too sharp and clear to be ancient and said it was a clumsy attempt at fraud. Dr. Chessman was the only one to speak positively, and he maintained that they could be real. Cryptologist Dr. William Adams with BYU took a look at the linguistics. He states, "I found so few clusterings that from a language point of view, I am forced to conclude that instead of meaningful script, the work was a haphazard scratchings of a forger." Sadly, the inscriptions were dismissed simply because the cryptologist could not read them. Now, all of these men went to a luncheon at the Winch home. The table was set with napkins, printed with registered cattle brands in honor of Mrs. Winch's late husband, who was a cattleman. When the cryptologist opened his napkin, he was dumbfounded. He saw what he thought were the very same characters from the tablet he had examined. He was convinced that Brewer's inscriptions had been copied from the local brands. Pictured here is the script on the right from the stone tablet in question and a photo of the napkin. A close look at this napkin shows that these brands are far from local. They extend the entire length of Utah. Would Brewer really be familiar with brands from Randolph to St. George? Furthermore, the brands are, of course, variations of letters and symbols. Understandably, they will resemble characters from many languages. We do know, however, that there was some fraud. Brewer actually admitted to participating in the manufacture of items, particularly lead. His way of showing people what he had found without taking the chance on losing the originals. It was also an effective way to test the integrity of others. If he loaned someone a plate and they never gave it back, he knew they could not be trusted. We should also consider it would have been relatively easy to use the stone forms from the cave to cast lead copies of the plates. Now up here on the right is the so-called gold plate. It was subjected to X-ray spectrograph analysis. The plate was not gold at all. It is brass consistent with the cartridge of a rifle bullet. Now I don't know if this next one is fraudulent or coincidental, but that sure looks like Snoopy to me. Now, Brewer was unable to get photos inside the cave, as I've mentioned. He removed plates and other items, and Bishop Merlin Nielsen covered the cost to have them photographed by Lucian Mound, who was a professional photographer for the church. Again, quoting J. Golden Barton, when he had completed his work, he mailed President David O. McKay a complete collection of the photographs. In return, he received a letter from the president of the LDS Church asking him to seal the negatives, which he claims to have honored to this day. Only Brewer has copies of the photographs. There were, however, two men posing as university officials who purchased copies of the prints. They weren't. They paid with a check, which did not clear, and Brewer never saw them again. By this time, Brewer was very disappointed and determined to have no further contact with BYU. He retained a respect for Dr. Chessman, but avoided contact with both church and university officials. Brewer's admission of fraud was understandably a setback for Chessman, Barton, and their associates, but they continued to support him in his efforts for many years. It is notable that other tombs and treasures were discovered in the surrounding area, particularly during the 1970s. Pictured here is an empty tomb south of Manti, believed by some to have been Brewer Cave. Recently, a friend of mine shares this story. While serving in the South San Pete Stake in 1974, a bishop was called to meet at the Manti Temple one evening. The bishops and stake presidency were taken to a corner of the temple lot where a chain link fence was being installed. One of the workers had tried to put in a fence post where a hole in the ground had given way. He noticed unnaturally stacked stones nearby and upon investigating, discovered an entrance to a cavern with steps leading down. The chamber contained the remains of a man and woman and many records upon tablets. The bishops and stake presidencies spent the night removing the contents of the cavern, which were later taken to Salt Lake, and a capstone was put over the entrance to the tomb. They were told never to talk about it, but this man said that he was no longer affiliated with the church, and most of those who had been there had passed away. He felt that it was time that someone else knew about it. We went out to the area, and sure enough, there are some shaped and stacked stones, as well as scattered debris at the site, matching the description. So this is what the spot looks like today, if it's the right spot. We have another eyewitness account by a man named Jason Stevens. Jason Stevens was working up on Chicken Creek near Wales several years ago when a man came into camp claiming that someone he knew had found 2 mummified giant bodies up there all decked out. This man had been up all night looking for the tomb. Well, Jason thought it was a lie and said so. But the next week, the man was up there again, and this time he showed Jason a huge breastplate from the tomb that must have weighed 65 to 70 pounds. He mentioned a sword, but only showed Jason the breastplate. Now, the tablet in the photo here is purported to have been found on Chicken Creek, but I've not been able to verify that. It's still interesting to see. As we've seen, similar burials have been discovered, but now it's time to go back to Brewer Cave. As I mentioned, the remarkable mummified remains were each lying in a stone sarcophagus. After prying off the lid, Brewer did not disturb them, but pulled down the straw-like cloth to take a look. There were 3 blankets coated with resin lying on top of them, and there was very little dust inside the boxes. This is more artwork by Trisyla Brewer, John Brewer's granddaughter. The male had red hair, was approximately 9'2", and was 3 or 4 feet across the shoulders. The female was approximately 8 feet 10 inches, had blonde hair that remained intact when touched. The skin was still attached, was soft, almost moist, and felt like tanned leather. They seemed to be about 40 or 50 years old at the time of death, and each had an elaborate golden crown and breastplate. The remains seemed well preserved, and the only thing that crumbled was the feathers, presumably upon the female's crown. Relatively few alive today are aware that a giant red-haired people once roamed this land. Knowledge of them has been suppressed. However, Native Americans have known the legends for centuries and use various names for the giant people. A few of them are listed here. I'll go through them kind of fast. The Sitika were red-haired cannibalistic giants who plagued the ancestors of the Paiutes until they annihilated them. You may have heard the story of Lovelock Cave. The Alagui were a giant race of mound builders encountered by the Lenni Lenape and others. These giant people were living east of the Mississippi, building forts and entrenchments. The Starnake, the Navajo described them as a regal race of white giants endowed with mining technology who dominated the West. The Nahulo were described by the Comanches as a rich and powerful race of white giants 10 feet tall who built mound cities and were wiped out by the Great Spirit for their pride and lack of mercy. Now these are all reminiscent of the Adena, one of 2 groups of mound builders known for their great earthworks in the eastern United States. They lived approximately 2000 BC to 600 BC. All of these descriptions bear a striking resemblance to the culture of the Jaredites of the Book of Mormon, which I mentioned earlier. And remember, the Jaredites ultimately destroyed themselves in a civil war. Here is a quote from John L. Sorensen. Ether writes of the annihilation of his people, but this was not necessarily an extermination of the entire population. One may assume that many of the commoners were not in the 2 armies and thus survived after these wars, since explicit features of Jaredite culture were later evident in the Nephite culture. Critics of the Book of Mormon record have listed many items attributed to Book of Mormon cultures that seemingly do not exist in the archaeological records. Ancient brass, stone boxes with writing on metal plates, horses, chariots, wheat, elephants, and the list goes on. Now that the suppressed knowledge of the giants is coming to light, it is very interesting to find that evidence of the very items on that list are being discovered in the burials of the giant people. Now this is why we call them giants. We're not talking about 30-footers. On the left is Harold Wadlow, 5 feet 11 inches, and his son Robert at 8 feet 11 inches. Robert had a disorder called gigantism and passed away in 1940. On the right is a 9-foot mummy from California discovered in 1895. The Brewer Cave mummies are approximately the same size. Evidence of giant people 7 to 10 feet tall does exist in the archaeological record. Literally, thousands of skeletal remains of a fair-skinned race of giants has been documented clear across America. In the state of Utah, we know of remains in Salt Lake, Payson, Nanti, Moab, Kanab, and others. These giants often, but not always, had red hair, enormous jaws, double rows of teeth, 6 fingers, 6 toes, and very large heads. I recently acquired these photos from my friend Dan Lowe. This is a 9-foot Mongolian-type male and an 8-foot red-haired woman. These were found near Kanab in holes bored from solid sandstone. There's a photo here showing where they were found right there. And I'm not sure how they made that foot cast, but it measures 17 inches long. The Salt Lake Giant. This is from the New York Sun, August 27, 1891. The gigantic skeleton of a man measuring 8 feet 6 inches was found near the Jordan River just outside Salt Lake City by a workman who was digging an irrigation ditch. The skeleton was standing upright. The skull measured 11 inches in diameter and the feet 19 inches long. A copper chain to which was attached 3 medallions covered with curious hieroglyphics was found around the neck of the skeleton, and near it were found some copper medals. Archaeologists believe that the original owner of the skeleton belonged to the race of mound builders. Now notice the medallion on the Brewer Cave mummy's chest, and that photo there is another medallion that was found in the cave. And then here are some drawings and photos of a few more medallions. Some of these have drawings to show the detail, and I know the photos are a little blurry, but the designs are interesting nonetheless. Now that we have access to information regarding the burial details of the giant people, we will compare the similarities between the documented giants and John Brewer's alleged giants. Let's keep in mind that in John Brewer's day, there was no internet, and much of this information was inaccessible, undiscovered, or completely unknown. On the next few slides, I'm going to be reading only the words in bold, and we'll show a few comparisons. Belt Mountains, Montana, 1889. A gold hunter, while prospecting the Belt Mountains, discovered a mysterious cavern. At the foot of the stairs was a skeleton of a man, 9 feet 6 inches. Underneath was a gold plate 10 inches long, 6 inches wide, covered with strange devices, hieroglyphics. And then we have the Moundsville Giants, West Virginia, 1883. Giant skeletons were found. There was also a stone tablet on which were inscribed characters that resembled ancient hieroglyphics. Another skeleton was wearing pieces of mica on the shoulders, which appeared to be epaulets. You know, the shoulder pieces on a uniform. And a large piece of copper on the chest seemed to be a shield. As you can see, the Brewer Cave mummy had a sword, shield, and breastplate, and something that resembles epaulets. Gartersville, Mississippi, 1884. The discovery was of the remains of a giant wearing a copper crown. The bodies were encased in a network made of straw. The tomb was covered with large flagstones engraved with inscriptions. The Death Valley Giants, Nevada, 1947. Dr. Bruce Russell, following up on reports that the Smithsonian had hidden evidence of giants found in Death Valley, imagine that, reported finding 8 and 9 foot giants, hieroglyphics carefully chiseled into polished granite, extensive weapons, and also the well-preserved remains of dinosaurs, saber-toothed tigers, imperial elephants, and other extinct beasts. Now here you can see the dinosaur heads on the flagstone. Others claim that those look like alligator heads or serpents, but they look like dinosaurs to me. April 2015, the Ute Tribal Council met with Wayne May to discuss an ancient tomb located deep within the Ute Reservation in the Uinta Mountains. The tomb contains skeletons 11 feet tall with red hair and decorated in full armor. The sarcophagus had a stone lid that swung open like a door. There was a polished granite stone, 8 feet square with script on it, and many, many records inside the tomb, including numerous blackened plates of silver. The Utes told Wayne that they saw John Brewer going into the tomb and told him never to come back. This was possibly another site marked on the map rock. And then we have Catalina Island, California, 1920s. Professor Ralph Glidden and his team exhumed 3,781 skeletons of a blonde-haired race of giants. He found that this highly intelligent, fair-skinned race thrived in the West 3,000 years ago. Among the items found were a thin piece of slate, a map rock showing trails to the 4 main burial grounds, similar to the Brewer map rock, while another included trinkets and small stone rings. In addition, the team found the remains of a megalithic Stonehenge-era temple, which would date to approximately 2,500 BC. Now, I'm sure you've noticed that the Brewer Cave woman is wearing a breastplate. This is from Hugh Nibley. It is certainly the case with the Jaredites, whose kings are before everything leaders in the field, and who go to battle with their wives and their children, both men, women, and children, being armed with weapons of war, having shields and breastplates, and being clothed after the manner of war. Pace in Utah, 1870. 2 skeletons were excavated. The male was 6'7" and had a sword at his side. The tomb was described as a house with clay pipes for water conduction. There were skeletons and bones of all kinds of animals, including horses, and clay molds for casting iron implements. Remember, Brewer Cave had stone forms for shaping metal plates. Wheat kernels were found inside a stone box. When planted, they grew to become the finest wheat crop in 5 Utah counties. Incidentally, I followed up on that wheat, even as far as the United States Department of Agriculture seed bank. They have the ancient mound wheat on record, but sadly, the actual seed has been lost for decades. We cannot ignore the fact that there is also some connection between the female mummy's headdress and the ancient pueblos of the Southwest. The interesting headdress is called a tablita. Now, if you were to Google the word tablita, you would be told that it is a Spanish word from the time of the conquest. But that's not entirely true. Among the Hopi, whose language descends from 1500 BC, tablita means crown. Pueblo Indian women still wear the tablita for ceremonial dances in remembrance of the ancient ancestors, but most do not know the history of where it originated. According to Dr. James Harris, the scallops and squares are the American Indian sign for cloud altars, which the Hopi and Zuni regard as stairways to the sky or ascension into heaven, perfect for the burial of a queen. Brewer had mentioned when he described the mummies that the feathers had crumbled. Well, tablitas once had feathers on them, also representing ascension. Ancient burials of the Southwest have produced such rare items as headdresses and copper bells. A child's burial included a copper bell and bead necklace. Bells were also found with the controversial Padilla plates of Mexico, which were inscribed with characters similar to those of the Book of Mormon. A friend of mine has seen photos of yet another central Utah burial of an 8-foot man and a 10-foot woman. She had on what was described as a yoke-type headdress with alligator heads and bells on it. Similar to this headdress, I guess. There are over 200 black and white photos of the contents of that tomb that are currently, the location of those are unknown. Now here are some examples of the tablita in Native American rock art from Three Rivers, New Mexico. If you look close, you can see the different ways they depicted that. And then here is a sample of the tablita in modern art. The caption reads, "Dawn speaks. Ancestors and keepers of the sacred ways are awakened by the powers of the spirit world. Dawn comes with a sun face wearing a tablita of 7 stars." And here are some beautifully decorated stone boxes from Brewer Cave. There's a symbol of the tablita or cloud altar on the top of this box. If you have a good eye, you might be able to find it, along with many other intricate designs. There's a notable ship on the side, and on the top of the lid, there's a man with wings. Very interesting. Now this one seems to depict a horse and chariot, along with other strange markings. You'll notice that this particular box has 2 compartments. Now, several years ago, a similar box was unearthed in the Manti area. A woman hiking up a ravine after a flash flood noticed a square corner sticking out of the ground under a sagebrush. Upon investigating, she discovered a red stone box with intricate designs on it that definitely looked very ancient. It had several compartments, similar to a jewelry box. A geologist claimed that the red stone came from Wisconsin. Now, those who have seen the box and spoken with the woman can't remember her name or the type of stone, only that she moved to Richfield. So I'm telling you this because if anyone has more information about that, I'd really love to track it down. This stone box is wrapped with juniper bark and pitch to make it waterproof. You'll notice it just has one small compartment, but it also has inscribed metal plates inside. Now, the academic community may say that there is no ancient writing on metal plates in North America, but we know that there is. In addition to the Book of Mormon, we know of records of the Creek and Shawnee, the controversial Kimberhook plates, records of the Ojibwa, Navajo records, the Belt Mountain plate, the Brewer Cave plates, possibly the Padilla plates of Mexico, the Michigan tablets, and many more. I'll give you a little more detail on some of these. Now on this slide, the plates pictured are from Brewer Cave, but we're going to talk about the Creek and Shawnee have 2 brazen tablets and 5 of copper, which they say were given to them by God. The tablets resemble breastplates or shields of ancient soldiers with writing on them, which many describe as Hebrew. They once had many more inscribed plates, but they have buried them up with notable men. Navajo records. According to Marilyn, a Navajo and current guardian of the ancient records of her ancestors, the Navajo have inscribed metal plates. Her great-great-grandmother had been on the Long Walk of 1864 when the Navajos were forced to walk 300 miles from Arizona across New Mexico to a new reservation. She was forced to trade some of the inscribed plates of her people to the soldiers for food. The rest were passed down to Marilyn's grandmother and then to her. Navajo records are passed from the grandmother to the youngest granddaughter. Before Marilyn's grandmother passed away, Marilyn being the youngest granddaughter, the grandmother told her that there was an envelope hidden under the windowsill for her eyes only. Inside was a letter telling Marilyn where the sacred records were buried. Now again, the plates pictured here are from Brewer Cave. Chief Copley tells us that most Indian nations of the West have places in which they deposit their records. Ojibwas have 3 depositories near Lake Superior, where 10 guardians check on them every 15 years. If any of the guardians have died, others are chosen, and all the known information regarding the records is given to the new guardian. If any records have begun to decay, they are taken out, and an exact facsimile is made and placed in its stead. These records are written on slate rock, copper, lead, and birch bark. The records are wrapped in swan or geese down and placed in a hollow cedar log smeared with gum. It is said to be a transcript of what the Great Spirit gave to the Indian after the flood. Now, they said an exact facsimile is made and placed in its stead. Very important. So if records are found and the plate itself is determined to be of modern origin, or say the inscription looks too sharp and clear, it is very possible that the writing still contains ancient history and should not be easily dismissed. The Brewer Cave plates deserve another look. A Canadian Indian, guardian of his tribe's ancient records by right of ancestry, saw the Brewer plates and claimed that he could read them, as the knowledge had been passed down to him through the generations. Brewer, in order to test the man's ability to understand the writing, secretly took random plates from various boxes and put them together for him to read. If the Indian read easily from one to another, Brewer would know the man was lying. Well, the Indian looked through them and commented how strange it was that they did not go together. One was a history, another spoke of burial practices, another of metals and chemistry, and so on. Brewer was so impressed with his ability to read the records that he gave the man a box of plates to keep. The Indian translated portions of the plates, and John must have taken notes. inserting a few of his own thoughts along the way. Pictured here are some of the notes in Brewer's own handwriting. According to the Canadian Indian, one of the copper plates from Brewer Cave has a date of 2500 BC and tells of a migration, a voyage across the ocean of the Tiwa people under a leader called Pyron, who was a leader under a leader, for it was his brother who talked with God. John Brewer, looking up, I find that they are known by a lot of names, but it adds up to what we know as Jaredites. We know from the Book of Mormon that Jared was a leader under his brother who talked with God. So, if the Canadian Indian was correct, these are the records of the Tiwa people, known by us possibly as Jaredites, and their leader Pyron. It's interesting to note, many generations later, we find Pueblo people today calling themselves Pyro and Tiwa. In fact, Tiwa is also a language. A Picurus Pueblo says, Tiwa, the mother tongue, is not an Indian language, it's an ancient tongue, constructed according to vibratory levels of Mother Nature. According to the ancients, the Creator created different languages, each with specific resonating qualities. The Native American tribes of Pyro and Tiwa can both trace their ancestry back to the Jaredite era. A Hopi Tiwa says, my ancestors had white skins, but because of evil things that happened, we lost all that. Now this is really interesting because the Jaredites were the only people that we know of who kept the Adamic language, the mother tongue. From the time of the Tower of Babel and the confusion of tongues, they brought it with them here. Now, notice the likeness of this plate seems to refer to the female mummy. The Indians said that the records from the cave spoke of battles and a war that devastated the nation. The few survivors carried records with them which they secreted away in various places in the southwest. These were written in order of importance on gold, copper, brass, stone, and clay. Some of the records chronicled the life history of the deceased. These were always left with the body. And on this one, notice the inscription from the male mummy's flagstone is here on this plate. Is it possible that the writing on the plate speaks of the man who's buried here? Quoting from the notes of the Canadian, some plates told of history ranging from as far back as Adam up to the time of the man who was buried there. And quoting from this translation, we read, a messenger from the south country has come. Enemies are looking for us. Records are to be gathered and packed. We shall take them with us. Some are to be buried with our old leader, Light, for they are his life and deeds. Now, I recently came across a surprising reference to Light Indians. I was actually looking up the origin of the names of the Utah counties when I discovered that the name Wasatch is a Light Indian word meaning mountain pass. I got searching around on the internet and can find no other reference to the Light Indians, yet one has to wonder if it's his descendants that call themselves by his name. Now, this stone box was given to Paul Chessman, still sealed, with the juniper bark and pitch to keep out the moisture. When opened, there were 6 plates inside, including the 2 we previously viewed pertaining to the history of the mummies. These are various photos of the 6 plates from the stone box. Up to this point, there were more questions than answers in the saga of Brewers Cave. Finally, in 2005, the Ancient Historical Research Foundation took a sample of the juniper bark from this box for testing. The test was run 10 times to be sure that the results were accurate. 10 times, they obtained these results. Dr. Stephen Jones, physics professor at BYU, reports, with a radiocarbon age of 5 BC to 390 BC, the Brewer bark sample is thus scientifically demonstrated to be very old. The Brewer findings, if further verified, could force archaeologists to rewrite currently accepted history of the area. The bark used to cover the stone box in question is indeed ancient. It would be highly desirable to reopen the cave where the box was found, with certified archaeologists present. Now, my friend Larry Liston owns this bark and was kind enough to let us bring it today. It's up here on the table. If you'd like to take a look at it afterwards, you're welcome to. So, in order to reopen the cave with an archaeologist present, it must be relocated. John Brewer, remember, covered it over and hid it well. As mentioned before, he used dynamite to close the main entrance and entered through a small hole which he concealed with a large stone and brush. He said that he did not show the cave to anyone except his son, who died young. Many have searched for it, but the exact location has remained a mystery. Terry Carter has researched this subject for nearly 25 years, conducting interviews, compiling and retaining pertinent information. He has deciphered the clues regarding the location of Brewer Cave, combed the hills, and located a site in the area that matches the description, including the mark revealed to Maud Cox by George Keller identifying the cave. An electromagnetic field test of the site reveals 3 voids in the target area, suggesting the possibility of a third chamber unknown to John Brewer. Further scans have revealed the square corners, which you see in the upper right photo up there. Inside a small chamber, Terry uncovered the remains of items John Brewer was known to have used in the cave: candles, tools, blasting caps, dynamite, and even carpet. Remember the item he was using to prepare for Paul Chessman's visit when the ceiling collapsed? So the next step is to locate Brewer's small entrance, hopefully providing safe passage into the burial chamber to identify positively if it is indeed Brewer's Cave and the resting place of the ancient records and giant mummies. As more information is brought to light, Brewer Cave may yet be proven to contain remains of a highly intelligent race of giants, as well as a record of their marvelous civilization. One more exciting piece of information: this little ring was lying next to the female mummy. You can see it here in the drawing. An authentication report was done on this. The evidence strongly suggests a manufacturing date older than 1200 BC. So John Brewer's claims are certainly plausible. Giants did roam this land of America. Tombs, skeletons, and artifacts have been located, and archaeological records verify them all across the nation. Metal records are not unknown in North America. Native histories, eyewitnesses, and tangible plates verify their existence. Unreadable script and modern-looking inscriptions do not diminish the possibility of ancient, authentic history inscribed on metal plates. Items discovered by John Brewer have been scientifically proven to be at least 2,000 years old. Now, I like to end with a scripture. Moroni gives this account. "I do not write these things which transpired from the days of Adam until the great tower, but they are had upon the plates, and whoso findeth them will have power that he may get the full account." So it makes me question, what all did John Brewer find? And how much did he really know? Here's one final word from John Brewer himself. "I don't expect anybody to believe me, and I'm not worried either, because I know what I've got." So, thank you all for coming today.
And I told him, I says, "Criminy John," I says, "you won't have to work on this ranch." I says, "Let's go get this stuff," and I says, "We'll get enough money that we can buy a ranch."
Has he ever been in your cave?
No.
He doesn't even know where it's at.
He don't. Not that much.
Okay, has anybody ever been in besides you and your son?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
Dr. Jennings took that and took it to the Smithsonian.
And it was just full of artifacts and things. And that's why he was so opposed of letting anybody else in there, of taking anybody down there, because he didn't want anybody to disturb it. And he said if he could get it into the right hands, the right people, and that's why he went to the BYU, wanted them to help him. But they didn't do anything.
Dr. Jennings says whenever anybody won't tell you who or what, and it's a secret and he won't tell you where he found it and all that. He said, don't believe them. And that's when it's fraudulent.
And there were 2 sarcophagi, the large ones, which eventually he and his son unlidded and found the 2 mummies, the male and the female, with the headdresses.
Well, he told me that he feared for his life and his family's life.
My husband said to John Brewer, "Now you're in the presence of an apostle of the Lord. And is your story true?" And he said yes.
He first found it from the smoke overhead on a kind of an archway of rock.
A lot of soot right in here.
A lot of blackness.
Huh, that's cool to have soot on the archway. Hey, we might be able to do a radiocarbon dating on that soot, by the way. That'd give us some information. Support rod. Look, now that looks like green rock there, which is interesting. That's not just the light. You're hitting, and there's fibrous material that's woody stuff. Back up. There's an opening.
Okay, forward there. Oh, there's 2 openings. There's one there and
there
there's
is
one
2.
above it.
Yeah, there are 2 openings.
Looks like cut stone right there.
That looks like very square stone. Look at that.
We may have found the steps, Terry.
Look, see if you can keep going there, Terry.
What he did then was caused an avalanche to cover up the entrance, and then he drilled, whatever, a hole about 18 to 20 some odd inches in diameter down from the top straight down to the entrance where he had closed it up. And so he ended back up in the same place where he was, only it was hidden pretty well from then on.